to talk about Essex windmills and the stock windmills in particular. I think this is the earliest picture of the stock mills that we know of, and the existing tower mill is on the left, and there were two post mills standing to the right. Now at this time, the tower mill was sort of fairly primitive, you could say, and it wasn't exactly as it is today. One difference you will notice is that around the bottom of it there is a gallery or a stage, and that was to access the sails, because it had at that time cloth covered sails, and the miller actually had to spread the cloth on the sails using cords and initially climbing up them to untie it and then pull it across with cords. And so he needed to be able to get to the sails in order to do that. That was before the shuttered sails were invented. The two post mills on the right were sort of moved from other places, and you'll see that they appear to have carts in front of them and a funny sort of structure with a cross bracing on the front. Now this is, I think, also to access the sails. I think the carts were actually fixed to the mill, the body of the mill, by that wooden structure. And on a post mill, of course, the whole body has to turn around to face the wind, so to get the sails into the wind. So the cart would trundle around with the body, moved by that wooden structure, and the miller would actually have to climb up onto the cart body in order to set the cloths again. The roundhouses under the mills, those two post mills, those mills have been actually raised higher than they were intended to be originally, and that's why they needed that cart system to reach the sails to set them. As far as I know, there's no photographs exist of these post mills, and I've never seen another photograph of that system with the cart and the structure making it turn. But some post mills did have a kind of platform which was pushed round by the miller and used to set the sails, but this is a slightly different idea. And this is the only illustration, as far as I know, showing the three mills. Now this is in later times, and one of the post mills has disappeared. I think it's the one in the middle that's disappeared. And both mills have black sails. You'll notice the sails are black, and that's because the canvas is set on them. They're set to work, and the canvas is entirely covering the framework of the sail. And the sailcloths would be dressed with tar or something to prevent them from getting mildewy and rotting away. So that's why they look black. And you'll see the tower mill on the left still has the gallery, and I don't know if you can see the cap hangs over to the left at the back, and there's a chain hanging down from it which hung down to the gallery. And the miller turned the cap of the windmill by pulling on that chain, and it went round a wheel in the cap of the mill, and that drove onto cogs on the curb around the top of the tower. And when the miller pulled on the chain, it caused the cap to go round and face into the wind. The post mill, on the other hand, also had to be faced manually to the wind, but that has steps coming down the back, and emerging from the steps is a longer pole which is supported by a rod coming down from the back of the mill that you can see there. And in order to turn the post mill, the miller would raise the steps with a lever and then push on the pole and turn the whole body, the white body of the windmill, around to face the wind. So these were windmills of a fairly primitive kind, before the refinements that came with the Industrial Revolution. Now, this was probably taken, I don't know exactly when, probably between 1900 and 1920. And this shows the tower mill, because the post mills had gone by then. And it had been fitted with shuttered sails and a fantail to turn it automatically to the wind. You can see the shutters in the sails, which are in the closed position. They work like a Venetian blind, opening and closing simultaneously, and there'll be about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There'll be about 30 shutters in each sail, of the single-sided kind, and 60 in each sale, or perhaps a bit less on the double-sided kind. And they were patent sails which were operated by a rod passing through the hollow axle of the sails to the back, and they were controlled by a wheel and chain hanging down, and that's why it's got that structure hanging down from the back of the cap with the pole hanging down. You can see the chain hanging down below it. And by that time the mill had been fitted with a fantail. That's a little set of 6 sails at the back, and that was geared to the top of the tower and kept the cap facing the wind. But the miller still had to pull on a bit of a chain to open and close the shutters in the sails. But the patent sail was invented in 1807, and the fantail was invented about 1757. But they didn't always install them straight away in a mill, because it was much cheaper to build a simple mill and then add these things later. So the mill by that time was automatic. But I'll draw your attention to the axle of the sails, which you can see there. You can see there's a great lump of wood in the middle of the sails, and that is a wooden axle. The sails at that time were still being carried on a wooden axle, and at the head there it would probably be about 18 inches square. A huge piece of oak which acted as the axle. It had 2 sockets cut through it for the main beams of the sails. And eventually they started making these wind shafts out of cast iron. And Stock Mill indeed has a cast iron shaft today, but that photograph shows it with the previous wooden shaft. Moving on in time, it could be the 20s, I don't know. But it's still got the same kind of fantail. You'll notice that fantail sticks out of the back of the cap a very long way. But if you look on the ground, bottom right of the mill, you can actually see the wooden shaft taken out of it lying on the ground. That was the old wooden shaft which was previously in the cap, and by that time it had been replaced by a cast iron shaft which was entirely durable. Because the wooden shafts would last between 30 and 50 years, and then they became rotten and they had to be replaced. But the cast iron shafts lasted indefinitely. I think this was probably taken in the 1930s, and there are 2 things I'd like you to notice. One is that the fantail is now much closer into the cap. They put a new fantail staging on, which has brought it very much further in and higher. But having that long, heavy fan stage on it in previous years seems to have done an awful lot of damage to the cap, because you can see the whole thing is sagging towards the back. You see how it tilts downwards. And it had in fact broken the main timbers of the cap, so they put a new fan stage on, which wasn't quite so bad, but the damage was already done. But nevertheless, the mill carried on working, and it was in working condition there. Going around the back of the mill, you'll see the cluster of buildings, of outbuildings, that were connected with the mill, which they're now, there's a bungalow behind the mill, and these would have been in the grounds there. And the building to the right contained an engine, probably an oil engine, which could be attached to the mill using a belt to drive it when there wasn't enough wind to work the millstones. And that thing sort of sticking out at the left of that building with a sort of prop under it, that is part of a casing where the belt came out. And the windmill has a pulley on the side of it, which is there today, to which the belt was attached to run the machinery if there wasn't enough wind to turn the sails. And you can see the various store buildings and other buildings on the left. I don't know why that building to the extreme left is striped like that. I think somebody must have gone a bit mad with the paint or something. But that's the mill as it last worked. And soon after that, it fell out of use. And this is probably just post-war. I think the Essex County Council took over the mill in 1944 to prevent it from being demolished. And they tidied it up. It still had the original sails on. By that time the fantail staging had become rotten, so it was sawn off and the back of the cap was just a flat back put on. And they've tried to sort of trim the cap up to make it look as though it's level, because you see the vertical skirt of boards along the side of the cap is sort of horizontal, but you see the back of the cap is still hanging down. It's really only a cosmetic job. And of course it didn't have any windows in then either, so it was sort of saved from demolition but rather neglected. Now we come on to my connection with the mill. I took this about 1975 when I joined the Essex County Council. Previous to that I was working as a millwright, freelance, but this job came up with Essex County Council, which and they owned at that time 5 mills, 4 windmills and a water mill, and they were all in quite a poor state of repair. They'd been rather neglected, and they'd sort of kept them up, but they hadn't decided to go any further with them. But at that time a decision was made to get them all into good condition and try and open them to the public. And so that was my brief when I took the job on. At that time, Stock Mill was mostly a host to large numbers of pigeons, and the mess they made in the top had to be believed. In fact, most of the mills housed a fair number of pigeons, but Stock had a particular attraction for them, and they were very difficult to get rid of. Anyway, I looked at all the mills, and I decided that Stock Mill was not in as serious a condition as some of the others, so I started work on the post mill at Aythorpe Roding, and Stock Mill sort of remained on the back burner for a while. And also, I think we were going through a bit of a financial problem at the time, so there wasn't a great deal of money. But at that time, this would be the sort of middle to late 70s, they had a manpower services youth training scheme and for unemployed youngsters, and so we took advantage of that, and I had a couple of youngsters and a foreman chappie who worked under me, and one of the first jobs we did was to take down 2 of the sails, which, as you can see, were extremely wrong and threatening to fall down. So anyway, that they had to come down because they were unsafe. And then the next job was to repoint and repair the brickwork. There are the 2 lads on the right and the foreman on the left. And they worked for about 9 months on the mill. We had scaffolding on it, cutting out bricks and replacing bricks and repointing it. Because the brickwork of the mill was rather poor, the bricks had a sort of hard skin, and where that hard skin flaked off, they powdered away rather quickly, so those bricks had to be cut out and replaced with new bricks. And that was quite a time-consuming job. This shows the mill with scaffolding around it at that time, and the pointing of the brickwork was going ahead. I forget exactly how many bricks. I think we replaced over 5,000 bricks in the tower, and I think it's still in reasonable condition today, so it was a good thing to do. And also we patched the cap, which was starting to deteriorate a bit. As you see, it's a boat-shaped cap, so named because it looks a bit like an upturned boat. And there were quite a few mills in South Essex with boat-shaped caps, but there are very few left now. The only 2 left are the Stock Mill itself and the mill at Upminster. But there were others. There was one at South Ockenden and one at Springfield, and I shall show you a picture of Springfield Mill later. Well, the mill was dismantled, and the first thing to be worked on really was the curb, and this is the track that the cap of the windmill turns on, and it's made of wood, but it has iron cogs around the outside and an iron track on the top, and there's also an iron track underneath the cap, and between the 2 tracks there is a kind of railway of rollers that make it turn very easily because the rollers roll on the 2 tracks. The woodwork had deteriorated in places. We had to replace some of it. You can see some parts taken out on the far side. and we took out all the track plates and the cogs in order to repair the woodwork. That's a close-up of part of the track, and you can see some cracks. There's the track in the middle that the rollers ran on. You can see some cracks, cracked right across in two places. So the track had to be replaced, and we replaced it in mild steel rather than cast iron, because that would be more resistant to cracking. The cogs were all right on the outside. They were just removed and put back again after cleaning up. That's the repair job going on. You can see the new track plates of steel in the middle, and the cogs have been taken off and cleaned and painted and put back. And there's also an internal, on the right hand side, there's a lip to prevent the cap from being lifted off. There are some horizontal rollers that run under that, so that stops the cap from being blown off in a storm. And that's the curve now complete going back onto the tower. Nowadays we use cranes extensively for mill repairs because they make the job so much easier. In the past they would have had to have more or less hoisted everything up from ground level by hand using blocks and tackles and assembled it on top of the mill. So as you can imagine, there was a great deal of effort involved, and a lot of people were involved in these jobs. But the modern mobile cranes make it much easier, because they can just lift a whole component like that curve onto the top of the tower, and then all we have to do is fix it down. This is the framing of the cap after we took it down, with all the ribs and things taken off. A lot of it wasn't in too bad a condition, but the main timbers of the cap were cracked. You can perhaps see the way the back of the cap is bending down, so we had to repair that a bit. But we left it more or less like that, but just reinforced it, not wishing to replace too much of the original material. This was carried out by a firm from Sussex, E. Hole and Son, which aren't in existence anymore. They did most of the work under my direction, because at that time I did a certain amount of, or quite a lot of the work on the mills for the county council directly myself and with others, but we decided to employ contractors as well to speed the work along a bit. And fortunately at that time money was available for that sort of thing. This is repositioning the shaft, the cast iron shaft that I talked about earlier, which replaced the wooden one. There you can see it in position on the cap frame, and you can see the fitting on the left, the canister that actually carries the two pairs of sails, and you'll see that it consists of two rather fancy looking boxes at right angles, and the main timbers of each pair of sails are wedged into that, and we call that the canister. The wheel you see on the shaft there being repositioned is called the brake wheel, because it has a brake that acts on the rim bit that stops the sails from turning if you don't want to, and brings the mill to a halt when you've finished milling or you want to stop it. This wheel had a wooden rim with wooden cogs and cast iron spokes, and you can see the spokes in the middle there, but the spokes were broken. They'd obviously had an accident with it at some time in the past, and the original spokes were broken, so we had to cast a new set of spokes for it to make it safe, so that it would function properly. We thought of repairing them, but they really couldn't be repaired satisfactorily, being cast iron, and they were really rather thin, which was why they'd broken in the first place. So when we made the new ones, we made them very slightly thicker, so they'd be a bit more resistant to breaking. Braking in the sense of braking, and braking when you're applying the brake on the windmill. The beam on the left, which carries, which is fore and aft to you at the moment, is called the weather beam, and that was renewed because that was in bad condition. And there's the cap built up again with its boat-shaped roof frame. We were able to use a lot of the original ribs, repairing some of them in places, but we had to put them on a new base frame at the bottom, which is also curved. And so you can see the cap starting to take shape. And I designed a new fantail staging for it, because you'll remember that the original one had been sawn off and had disappeared. And there it is, based on the original design, and looking very much the same. And there they've started putting the weatherboarding on the cap again, on the ground, prior to lifting it. And here is the cap frame being lifted on. We didn't complete the cap. We decided to lift it on incomplete and then put the weatherboarding on up there, because we had a full scaffolding on the mill. And the cap was really quite a heavy one, and would have been quite difficult to lift if it had been fully equipped. And we had a bit of a problem with the crane at times, because it had to go through the gate and onto the grass. And the year we were doing this, it was a bit damp, and the crane sank in on a couple of occasions and got a bit bogged down, so they had to use plywood and all sorts of things under the wheels to do, because those cranes weigh an enormous amount, and they get bogged down very easily. But fortunately, we didn't. It was able to get itself out all right. And the other problem was turning into the lane, which is very narrow, and they had a bit of difficulty getting around that as well. But one way or another, they managed to do it. This is the cap frame actually being lowered onto the kerb, and if you look, you can see a new section we put in the kerb there. You can see the new timber, and above the cogs you can see perhaps see the individual rollers in their wooden cage. If you can see them all the way around. As I don't know, you probably see. We had to renew the rollers, because we found that although in theory they all ought to be the same size, some of them had worn down, so they were much smaller than others. So they had to be renewed to make sure they were all the same size and would work properly. And you can just see the cap circle underneath the cap, which runs on the wheels. We also had to set the kerb on the top of the tower level to make sure it was level, so the cap would turn properly. And all these things have to be thought about when you're doing a job like this. And there's the cap on. We lifted the windshaft on separately, and that's now on. You can see we've covered the brake wheel with a tarpaulin for the time being. Scaffolding is still up. And there's the cap just almost completed with the new weatherboarding on it. The weatherboarding was cedar. We used Western red cedar, which is a very durable timber, so it should last well. And the original boards were pine, and they'd rotted badly. And you can't, the pine you get today isn't as good as it used to be, so hopefully the cedar will last well into the next few years. And there's the mill with the fantail on and turning itself to the wind again, but without any sails. The sails had to wait for another year, so another budget, so they could be afforded. And they were made by a Millwright from Norfolk, called Seago, who made them to my plans. And once again, they were put up with the crane. And also you can see the cherry picker in use there for accessing the bolts and things to hold them in place. We copied exactly the design of the original sails, judged by photographs. I had to scale them off photographs too, because nothing remained of the original ones. And the sails that existed in the 70s were replacements. So nothing remained of the original, so they had to be scaled up and designed to look like the original. And there they are, with full set of sails on. and the mill began to look very much like a windmill again. The aim was to get it into working order, and so the next thing to be added were the shutters, and they had to wait a bit longer. There's another view at the back. One of the problems with this mill is it's very close to the neighbour's property, and fortunately the neighbours were very helpful, and they let us have water and a hose over when we were doing brickwork and that sort of thing. But the actual clearance between the mill and the boundary is very small, so it's very tight in places around there. It's a pity they didn't put the mill a bit further forward in the field, really, but of course perhaps it would have been better not to sell off quite so much land. But that was done in the 40s, of course, the development around the back of it, so they perhaps didn't think at that time of about having to do works to the mill in the future. And there's the mill more or less as it is today, with the shutters in place. We didn't put a full set in because the mill wasn't going to work all the time, and there's a lot of windage on a full set of shutters. You get winter gales, and we felt it was perhaps wise not to fit a full set. But the mill did work. I don't know whether it works today, but I did grind with it shortly after it was completed. This shows a little bit of work going on inside, and you can see here where one of the main floor beams goes into the wall, and the dampness of the brickwork had caused the end of the timber to decay, so we put in these spur beams underneath and new spreader beams in the wall and brick them in to provide proper support for the floors. The joists generally rested on a ledge, on an offset on the brickwork, so that they didn't actually enter the wall, so they tended to be in better condition. It was just the main beams that decayed. And these beams were all oak, and we didn't actually have to replace any of the main beams. They're still the original, but we just repaired the ends of them. This shows work going on to the millstones on the stone floor of the mill. The mill has 3 pairs of stones, and they're all different sizes. The largest set is 5 feet in diameter, and the smallest is 4 feet in diameter. And the middle ones, I think, about 4 foot 4. And they're all French burr stones, which are made from pieces of stone which are quarried near Paris at a place, well, one of the main quarries is a place called La Ferté-sous-Jouarre. And they were imported into this country, and the blocks were fitted together to make the round millstones and cemented together, and then iron bands were put around the rim to hold them together. If you look at the millstone in the foreground, bottom right, I think you can just see some of the joints between the pieces that the millstones are made of. And this is a very hard stone, and it's ideal for making flour because not too much stone is ground off during the grinding process. In fact, very, very little. Softer stones were used, but of course a certain amount of stone gets worn off, and you find it in your flour, and your flour's a bit gritty. So that's why they use this particular kind of stone. Now, in very early times, before the time of windmills, when they just used to grind their grain between a pair of stones by hand, they would use quite soft stones. And the skeletons and the skulls of those people that they dug up, they found that their teeth were worn very badly, and the reason was the amount of stone that they were actually eating with their bread. So hence the stone from France was very sought after, and was always used for milling flour. Windmills also produced animal feed, and a softer stone from Derbyshire could be used for that, a millstone grit. And they were made in one piece, but the animals didn't complain about the grittiness, and they didn't live long enough to get their teeth worn away anyway. But, now these are some old pictures, old black and whites of the interior of the mill, and these are photographs we used to try and get the interior of the mill as accurate as possible. This is looking up into the cap, and you can see the brake wheel, just the edge of it, to the top right, and that piece of wood with the chain on it is actually one of the brake shoes, which contracts on the rim of the wheel to stop the mill when it's not working. The wheel in the middle of the picture is called the wallower, and that's on top of a cast iron shaft that goes almost the whole way down the mill. Now, when Stock Mill was first built, it would have had wooden machinery, so this it must have been remodelled at some time during the Victorian era and modernised. And originally, the millstones were on the third floor, and there were only two pairs of them. And they were driven from above, and that vertical shaft would have been of wood, and all gears would have been of wood. But then they rejigged the interior, and they moved the stones down to the second floor, where there was more room, because the tower tapers, so there was more room to get them in, and the whole thing could work much better. The wallower wheel, which you see there, is actually cast iron, but it has a wooden rim bolted underneath it, and that works the sack hoist. And that's the wheel at the bottom of the picture, and that works by friction. So, and there's a lever that pushes that wheel up into contact with the wallower. And there is a drum with a chain on it, and when the miller pulls on the cord, which works the lever, the friction wheel there touches the underside of the wallower and starts to revolve and draws the chain up. And the end of the chain has a ring on it, which you form a loop and put it round the neck of the sack. And that chain hangs from top to bottom of the mill, and there are trapdoors roughly 2 feet square on each floor. So the sack can be hoisted right up to the top, and that saves the miller carrying it up on his back. So that's another use of wind power. This is how the millstones are driven. Now you can see the bottom end of the vertical shaft, and the upper of the horizontal wheels there drives two of the sets of millstones via those shafts you can see. The bevel gear facing downwards underneath the spur wheel was actually to drive the millstones by engine power from the pulley wheel on the side of the mill. So you could drive by wind power or by engine power, but you would actually disconnect the sails at the top to stop driving, to avoid driving the sails around, because that would absorb an awful lot of power. So you took a few cogs out of the wheel at the top, the brake wheel at the top, and then you could run with the engine. Most of the wheels you see here are made of cast iron, and they were put in by Christie and Norris of Chelmsford, who were millwrights in Chelmsford. And they survived until relatively recently as Christie brothers, who were electricians, but they were millwrights. And these cast iron wheels are actually cogged with wood, except the one on the right, which is all cast iron. You can see the wooden inserted cogs. And we had to replace a certain number of these cogs, because although they weren't badly worn, they suffered a lot from woodworm and were rather crumbly. So, but actually they weren't in bad condition really, and a lot of the originals are still in there. And I think in this case they've made them out of beech, but they can be made of other hardwoods such as apple wood or pear wood, or hornbeam, or home oak. Evergreen oak is also used with cogs, because it's resistant to wear. And they couldn't cast iron wheels very accurately in those days, and they cogged them with wood, or ran wood with iron, so they didn't make a horrible clanking noise, didn't wear too badly. But the wooden cogs would last about 50 years with careful use, so they didn't have to replace them that often. But when they did, they had to be very accurately cut to correct profile and correctly spaced, otherwise it wouldn't run well. This shows the millstone floor of the mill. Now earlier you saw the millstones, but this is the millstones with the cases on, or at least the set in the background has the casing on. And you can see the hopper, which is being fed from a bin above. You can see the vertical square chute coming down into the hopper, which is like an upturned pyramid. And that leads down into the shoe, which is that inclined wooden trough, sinking from right to left. And that is vibrated by the damsel, which is driven by the millstone. You can see that rising up from the end of the shoe. And it's spring-loaded with a wooden spring against the damsel, which is actually a 4-armed beater. So as the millstone goes round, it taps the shoe, and that keeps the grain feeding smoothly into the centre of the stone. And the angle of the shoe is critical to the correct feeding, because you don't want to feed too much or too little. And you can see a piece of string rising from the end of the shoe going up over pulleys and down to the floor below. And that would be adjusted by the miller to get the shoe at exactly the right angle to feed the grain in at the right speed. And once he got that right, it would look after itself. And the distance between the millstones was fairly critical, and that could be controlled from underneath. You can't see it too well here, but you can actually move those millstone spindles up and down to adjust the gap between the millstones. It's only a few thousandths of an inch, but it has to be kept to accurate tolerances so you get nice fine flour. Once again, you don't want them too close together because it will start wearing bits off the stones, and you don't want them too far apart because you'll get large lumps of grain or even whole grains coming through. It's got to be exactly right. And when the miller was working the mill, the ground grain would come down a chute, and he would test it between his finger and thumb and adjust the distance between the millstones accordingly. And when he felt it was right, then that was how he would leave it running. And that's the judgment of how to grind the grain is critical to stone milling, and it's a knack which you eventually acquire. Good luck. And that's a close-up of the millstone outfit there. You can see clearly the damsel, the 4-armed beater, rising up through the shoe. There's even some grain in there, because this was an old picture. It's probably taken back in the 30s. And the old Millwrights were craftsmen, and they were proud of their work. And if you look at some of the parts of that framework that carries the hopper, you'll see there's decoration on them, where that upright emerges from the corner of the octagonal casing. You see some nice little mouldings there, and also on the end of the transverse pieces. They took trouble to make things look nice, because they took a pride in their work. And, they were very skilled men. Now I'll just show you one or two pictures of other windmills around the area. This is the post mill at Billericay, and this actually fell down in 1929, but I think this picture was taken in the early 1900s, but it was out of use then. This was stood on Bell Hill, and in fact you can still trace the site today. It's actually in the garden of the house, and you can still see the 4 brick pillars that it stood on. And it fell down in 29, and some of the parts of it remained there until the 1970s, but I think most of it's been cleared away now. This was probably taken in the 40s or early 50s, and this shows the post of the mill still standing, although the body had collapsed. And you can see here how the post was supported by these sloping diagonal quarter bars, and they were mortised into two cross trees which cross underneath the post, and it rests on four brick piers where the quarter bars meet cross trees. And the body rests on the top of it, on a pin at the top, and some of the weight is taken by a collar. You can see that just above the quarter bars there's a square frame there that takes some of the weight under the body as well. And so the two post mills at stock would have had this kind of substructure underneath them. This is Mount Nessing Mill, but this is a very old picture of it. I think this was probably taken possibly in the 20s, maybe a bit earlier. And this shows it in its last working days as a working mill, although it more or less carried on into the 1930s. You can see a spare millstone leaning against the roundhouse there, and it looks a bit tatty, as many working mills did. It's not too well painted and it's a bit scruffy, but it was obviously still in use then. And that was long before anybody thought that these mills would be preserved. But that's a lot of them worked in that condition in their last days. They didn't have too much money because flour was coming in from the big commercial mills, which were built on the docks and worked by steam engines and so on. And the country mills had a job to keep their heads above water, to make a living. And so they just didn't have money for repairs, and so a lot of the mills ended their days like this, in a rather tatty condition. This is the mill at Springfield, of which nothing remains today. It stood near Pease Hall, which is spelt like peas pudding, Pease's Hall, Pease Hall, and it was a smock mill. And as you see, it has boat-shaped cap, rather similar to stock mill, but it's a bit shorter. And smock mills were tower mills, but built of wood, and they were usually 8-sided, as this one was. And they had basically 8 corner posts with framing in between them, but the top was the same as in a tower mill. This mill had quite a nice gallery round it, as you can see, with cross-braced railings round it. You can see I think there's probably a boy, or looks like a boy, doesn't look tall enough to be a man, standing on the gallery. And this was unusual in that the fantail behind the cap actually had 7 blades, which was an unusual number. Although there were some in this area that had 7 blades. There was one at Great Baddow, Upper Mill Great Baddow, which stood by Gallywood Common. That also had 7 blades. It was a rather similar looking mill. And also one at Hatfield Peveril, that also had 7 blades. So there was obviously a millwright around this area who, for some reason, liked 7-bladed fans, because normally they would choose an even number, like 8 or 6. But occasionally in some Sussex mills they had 5, but they would normally go for an even number, because if one of the blades broke, they could always take the opposite one off and run for a while with it would still be in balance then, and they could still work, the fan would still work, but depending on the time of making a new blade for it. I don't know exactly when this picture was taken, probably early 1900s, but it got into very bad condition. It was still standing in 1930 when it looked like that. So it was in a rather sad state, and it was pulled down not long after that, I think. You can see the fantail is actually dangling down at the back in disarray. And someone actually standing on the cap just to the right of the brake wheel. I think it was a favourite haunt of boys who loved to climb up that sort of thing. Only they didn't worry about it too much in those days. And usually there was no mishap. That's more or less all the pictures I've got to show you. But I'll just talk a bit longer about mills in general. I worked for the council Essex County Council between 1975 and 2000. And I got the 5 mills into working order. That was Finchley Field and Aythorpe Roding, Mount Messing and Stock, and the Tide water mill at Thorrington, a tidally driven water mill, which stands on a creek, Alresford Creek, and the water comes in when the tide's coming in, and originally it flowed into a pond behind the mill, and then when the tide reached the top and started to go down again, there would be an automatic gate to close, and then when the tide had gone down a bit more, the water would be used to turn the water wheel and turn the millstones. But in actual fact it isn't a tidal mill today, because they keep the head pond fresh because they use it for irrigation, but it is fed by the Tenpenny Brook, and the mill does still work, and I got it into working order. The mill at Finchley Field I repaired but didn't get into working order because it wasn't really very practical. It stands in a village and there's very little wind gets to it. But the mills at Mount Messing and Aythorpe Roding, and of course your mill at Stock, they all were capable of grinding flour at the time I left them, and I presume they still are. While I was working for the County Council, they also took on the water mill at Sybil Headingham, Alderford Mill at Sybil Headingham, and the steam-powered mill at Beeley near Malden, which was originally adjacent to a large water mill, but that was burnt down, and the steam-powered mill survived the fire, and used to belong to the Essex Water Company, but it was taken over by the County Council, and repair to that couldn't really start because of bats. These little creatures are very well protected these days, and they've taken a liking to living in the engine house, where they found nice little crevices in the wall to nest, and so we weren't allowed to go in there. But I believe nowadays a new roost has been found for them, or constructed for them, and they're gradually vacating, so perhaps one day the steam engine at Beeley will work again. Anyway, those are the Essex mills, and I decided to turn professional again after 25 years in local government, and since then I've been working freelance, doing quite a lot of work in Norfolk, where I find a lot of work on the Norfolk Broads, where there are lots and lots of windmills for draining the marshes, and they started building them there probably in the 17th or 18th century, and a lot of them remain today. There are actually the remains of 60 windmills in the Broads area, which drove either water wheels or centrifugal pumps to lift the water off the grazing marshes and into the river, and that meant that they could keep the marshes reasonably drained at all times of the year, and they were used for grazing cattle. Nowadays they're not used, of course, all the drainage is done by electricity, but there's still a lot of windmills there, and I was able to get 2 of those into working order and do repairs on others. But I hear most recently that with the government cuts, they're about to radically cut the budgets for looking after these Norfolk mills, so I don't know quite what their future is, but hopefully money will be found elsewhere. I think it's going to have to be raised locally by subscription rather than coming from the County Council of Norfolk. The most recent job that I've been connected with is a windmill in Jerusalem, believe it or not. Jerusalem in Israel, and it's known as the Montefiore Mill, or the Jaffa Gate Mill, and it was built in 1857 just outside the walls of the old city, and it was one of the first buildings to be put up outside Jerusalem walls, because at that time it was more or less bandit country, and but at that time it was becoming safer, and the mill was paid for by an English Jewish philanthropist called Moses Montefiore, and he lived in Ramsgate in Kent, and he lived in a place called Westcliff Lodge, which is now actually doesn't exist anymore, but some of the outbuildings still exist. And he paid for it because the Jews in Jerusalem at that time were having to pay over the odds for their flour, so he thought he would help them out by having this windmill built. And he commissioned the local millwrights from Canterbury to build this windmill, for which they charged £200, which seems incredible these days, but that's what it cost. And the mill was built of local stone, because Jerusalem is virtually built on bedrock, so they quarried it almost where the mill was, and built this stone tower. The Arab masons were used to build the tower, and it was built very thick. The tower is nearly 50 feet high, and it's 3 feet thick at the bottom. The walls are, so it's a very substantial tower. And the millwrights from Canterbury made all the machinery and the floors and the cap and the sails and everything, and they shipped them over to Jerusalem, but it wasn't very easy in those days. I imagine it was possibly a steamship, but it may have been a sailing ship that took the stuff over there. And it was unloaded at Jaffa, but then it had to be transported to Jerusalem on the backs of either camels or donkeys. So it wasn't very easy, and of course a lot of the parts of the mill were very heavy, so they had to make some of the parts in two pieces, such as the main shaft, the wind shaft, which carried the sails. They made it in two pieces so it could be bolted together, so that each part wouldn't be too heavy for these camels and things. Anyway, they got it all there, and the mill was put up and commissioned, and it worked for about 20 years, and then a steam mill was established and it fell into disuse. But he was thought of very well because he also built almshouses and did various other good work, so they decided to restore the mill as a memorial to him, and it remains that way today. But by the 1930s it got into very bad condition, and so they did it up as best they could, but a lot of the parts had been robbed out and sold for scrap, presumably, so really all that was left was the shell of the tower and this cast iron wind shaft. So the wind shaft was embedded in concrete on top of the mill, and 4 dummy sails were put on, and a copper dome was put over the top of it. About 3 years ago, I was contacted by some Dutch people who are involved with an organisation called Christians for Israel, and they raise money in Holland to do good works in Israel, and they had hit on the idea of doing this windmill up properly. So, but they realised it was an English mill, it wasn't like the Dutch mills, so they tried to find someone who knew what it would look like, and one way or another they got onto me. So anyway, I got involved with the project and drew plans and things for the mill, because I actually grew up in Kent, so I knew the Kent mills very well, and I knew what a mill built by the Holmans would look like. And also they had quite a few photographs which turned up of the windmill, some going almost back to the time when it was built, because of course people were photographing Jerusalem then because of its religious significance, and quite often they got the mill in the photograph, so we have these pictures. And so I prepared drawings of how the interior should look, because there were no floors left in it, it was just an empty shell. And anyway, all this has been accepted, they've raised the money, and it seems we might be starting on it early next year. And of course there's an odd coincidence in that I grew up in Ramsgate where Montefiore lived. And there's a Montefiore Avenue in Ramsgate, on the Broadstairs side of Ramsgate, so it's all rather odd, really strange coincidences and things. But anyway, it looks as though hopefully the situation in the Middle East won't get too serious, and we'll wait and see. But anyway, that's more or less what I've been doing. So and that's more or less the end of the talk. So if you, I'd be pleased to take questions.
Does anybody have any questions they'd like to
I live near Mill Beach, and there's 3 ponds. I've looked it up and they say they're ponds, but they're connected with the mill. What would they do?
Well, I imagine that would have probably been a tidal mill, like a water mill, driven by the tide. When you say pounds, do you mean they're sort of ponds or?
Yeah, 3 ponds. The biggest one, the first one, and then they're linked by ditches.
I see, yeah.
And then they go out.
They join up with the sea.
Yes, but I don't know that the sea doesn't come into them.
No. Oh well. They may have been spring-fed ponds, which were used to drive a water mill, because a number of mills were like that. There's one at Lawford, Sherburn Mill at Lawford, which is driven by a spring-fed pond. So perhaps that's what they were. And maybe the springs fed the 3 ponds, and then they were channeled into to drive a water mill.
Yes, the mill is there.
Yeah.
What would you estimate the cost of doing all that you did to save a stock mill?
Oh golly, well, I think it would have come up to something like probably about 100,000, something like that, all told. I think. If it's any guide, I think the total cost of doing this mill in Jerusalem, I won't be doing all of it. There's a Dutch millwright involved as well. That's going to come to 600,000 euros. So it's quite expensive. Yeah. Well, of course, things have gone up a bit since then, and of course we've got to put it in containers and ship it and all sorts of things.
So you'll be going out there, will you?
Yes, I've been out there twice already to survey the existing tower, but I should be going out there to, help.
How long will that take?
Well, we're hoping to get it all together in about 3 months. We'll prefabricate as much as possible in this country, get it all ready, so that we don't have to spend too long out there.
Well, Vincent, on behalf of all of us, I'd like to thank you very much for an absolutely fascinating evening. I live just off Mill Lane, so the mill is very much part of my life. But I've only lived here 10 years, and I didn't realise what bad condition it was in. I've only lived in the village since it's been restored, and to see all that work there, and also to see how many mills have disappeared. I think we're very, very fortunate in having a mill that's in wonderful condition, and to have someone with your skill. It must be a very rare skill now, is it, a millwright to put it back for us?
Yeah, it is actually. There are very few millwrights around, but I was involved in the training scheme, training some youngsters that finished just over a year ago in Norfolk. The Lords Authority decided they would try and train up 5 youngsters, and 3 of them, 4 of them carrying on with it anyway.
Well, that is wonderful news, isn't it? That it is still going to go on into the future.
We do need more though.
Yes, I would imagine. Well, thank you. It's been a fascinating evening. I'm sure everybody will agree with me. And every time we go past the mill now, we'll be able to know just how much work went into restoring it. So thank you very much indeed.